My husband looked straight at me, laughed out loud in front of a room full of corporate executives, and said, "It's just Deborah's cute little hobby." The entire table erupted into laughter. After 35 years of marriage, that was how Richard Elliot introduced the business I had spent years building with my own 2 hands. I just smiled, because I refused to let anyone see how deeply those words cut. 3 months later, his company filed for bankruptcy, but that wasn't even the most shocking part of the story. The real surprise was what happened to the woman everyone assumed would be the first to fail. If this story strikes a chord with you, please hit like and subscribe to stay with me until the very end. Let me know in the comments how you would react if your spouse mocked your dreams in front of a crowd. Also, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I read every single comment, and hearing your stories means the absolute world to me. If you had met me 10 years ago, you would have probably described me as a typical soon-to-be-retired American wife. Reliable, quiet, and easily overlooked. At least, that was how I often felt about myself. My name is Deborah Elliot, and I live in Columbus, Ohio. By the time I turned 62, I had spent over half my life building a home, raising children, and supporting my husband's career, making sacrifices that seemed to go entirely unnoticed. Especially by Richard. We had been married for 35 years. When we first met, he was ambitious, charismatic, and full of big dreams. Back then, I loved listening to him talk about the future. He wanted to build a successful company. He wanted financial freedom. He wanted a life neither of us had even imagined growing up. We chased those dreams together. At least, that's what I believed at the time. The truth is, over the years, Richard's dreams became the only dreams that mattered. When our children were small, I left my job as an administrative assistant to stay home and care for them. It wasn't a sacrifice I regretted. I loved being a mother. I packed lunches, attended school plays, stayed up through fevers, drove to soccer practices, and helped with homework. Meanwhile, Richard worked longer and longer hours. Every promotion he earned was celebrated as a victory for the whole family. At least that's what everyone said. No one ever asked what I had given up to make those promotions possible. Richard certainly never asked. As the years rolled by, his confidence ballooned into pride and then into something much colder. By the time we entered our 50s, he rarely consulted me anymore. He just informed me. He corrected me. Sometimes he spoke to me in the same tone he used with his employees. I hated it, but after decades of marriage, you learn to look the other way. Or at least, you tell yourself you have. Eventually, the kids moved out. The house grew quiet. Too quiet. For the first time in years, I began to wonder what was left for me. Not as a wife, not as a mother, but as Deborah. On a rainy Saturday afternoon, I happened to come across a video online about making handmade candles. It looked simple enough, just a little hobby to pass the time. I ordered a starter kit, then a second one, and then a third. Before long, our garage was filled with jars, essential oils, labels, wax blocks, and notebooks bursting with ideas. For the first time in years, I felt a spark of excitement for something that was entirely mine. I called my small venture Elliot HomeSense. The name felt professional, full of promise, like something that truly mattered. At first, I sold a few candles to neighbours, then to friends, and then to friends of friends. People kept coming back. They loved the scents, the packaging, and the personal, handwritten notes I included with every single order. Every sale brought a smile to my face. It wasn't about the money, it was the realization that someone was choosing something I had created with my own 2 hands. Richard never understood that. The first time I told him I wanted to turn this hobby into a real business, he laughed. It wasn't cruel at first, just incredibly dismissive. "Dad, if nobody gets rich making candles..." I remember smiling back. "I don't need to get rich." "Then what's the point?" I didn't know how to answer because the point wasn't the money. The point was a sense of purpose. But that was a distinction Richard could never seem to grasp. Months passed, and my business grew slowly. There were no dramatic breakthroughs, just steady online orders, local craft fairs, and repeat customers. It was enough to make me proud, but not enough to impress my husband. Whenever anyone asked what I was up to, Richard always found a way to make it sound insignificant. "She's just keeping herself busy. It's her retirement hobby. She likes to pretend she's an entrepreneur." Each comment seemed harmless enough on its own, but together they wore me down. The worst part was that he genuinely thought he was being funny. One evening, as I was carefully packing orders at the kitchen table, Richard walked in, carrying his briefcase. He glanced over at the boxes. "How much did you make today?" I told him the amount. His eyebrows shot up, and he smirked. "That's it? Well, I suppose that's a good day for a lemonade stand." I kept my eyes glued to the shipping labels. Richard continued, "You know, Deborah, running a business is a lot harder than people think." I looked up. What is that supposed to mean? It means running a real company isn't an arts and crafts project. I didn't answer because I knew exactly where the conversation was heading. It always led back to the same place. His company, his success, his intellect, his importance, and somehow, my complete insignificance. The truth was, Richard's company had become his entire identity. He didn't just take pride in his success. He needed to feel superior. That need would ultimately be his downfall, though I didn't know it yet. Back then, I was still trying to earn his respect, still trying to prove that what I was building had real value. One afternoon, my best friend, Sarah Mitchell, stopped by for coffee. She noticed the inventory stacking up against the garage wall, and her eyes went wide. "Deborah, you're really doing this?" I smiled faintly. "Not according to Richard." Sarah rolled her eyes. "Forget Richard." That was easier said than done. She studied me closely. "You know what bothers me the most?" she asked. "What?" "That you still feel like you need his approval." Those words hit harder than I expected, because she was right. I hated to admit it, but she was right. After 35 years, a part of me still desperately wanted Richard to look at my work just once and tell me he was proud of me. Instead, every new milestone I reached seemed to irritate him. The more excited I became, the more dismissive he grew. I couldn't understand why at the time, but looking back, I think I get it now. Success had always been Richard's territory. It was his identity, his source of power. Deep down, he hated seeing me build something that belonged solely to me, something he couldn't control. I remember standing alone in the garage one night after a long day of work. The shelves were lined with neat rows of candles. Boxes were stacked perfectly in the corner. The room smelled of vanilla, cedar, and lavender. I felt a deep sense of pride. It wasn't because I was making a fortune or proving anyone wrong. I was proud because for the first time in a very long time, I had created something for myself. What I didn't realize was that while my small business was quietly growing, the cracks were already starting to form in Richard's carefully constructed empire. They were tiny, easily ignored fissures at first, but they were there, and very soon those cracks would become impossible to hide. The dinner party took place on a Thursday evening in early September. I remember the date clearly because I spent 3 whole days preparing for it. Richard was hosting several of his most important clients, potential investors, and top executives from his company. According to him, it was one of the most critical networking events of the year. That meant the pressure was entirely on me. For 35 years, I had played the role of the supportive corporate executive's wife perfectly. I knew exactly what was expected. The house had to be spotless. The catering had to be flawless. The wine had to be chilled to the exact right temperature. The atmosphere had to feel effortless, even though it never actually was. By noon, I was already exhausted. I had prepared the appetizers, arranged the flowers, polished the glassware, and double-checked every single room. Shortly before the guests arrived, Richard did a walkthrough of the house. He looked around, gave a curt nod, and checked his watch. There was no "thank you," no sign of appreciation, just a brief inspection. It felt as though I were a hospitality employee, making sure everything met corporate standards. I shouldn't have been surprised. This had become our normal years ago. Still, a small part of me always hoped for something more. Around 6 o'clock, the first guests began to arrive. Luxury cars lined our driveway. Men in expensive suits walked through the front door, accompanied by women in designer dresses who smiled politely as they introduced themselves. In an instant, Richard transformed. His posture changed. His voice grew warmer. His trademark charming smile appeared. I often wondered where that version of my husband disappeared to whenever we were alone. The house quickly filled with conversation and laughter. I moved through the crowd with a tray, refreshing drinks. Most people were polite. Some were genuinely kind, while others barely noticed me at all. Again, I was used to it. Corporate gatherings have a way of making wives feel invisible. At one point, I found myself talking to a woman I hadn't met before. She appeared to be in her late 50s, elegant, poised, and highly observant. She was the kind of person who could command a room without ever raising her voice. Her name was Catherine Brooks, and at the time I had absolutely no idea who she was. As we stood near the dining room, she smiled warmly. "So, Deborah, what do you do?" It was such a simple question, yet it had been years since anyone at one of Richard's events had asked it. For a moment, I felt a flicker of hesitation. Then, remembering how hard I had been working, I straightened my posture. "I own a small handmade candle and home fragrance business." Her eyes lit up. "Really?" I nodded. "Yes, I make candles, soaps, and gift sets, mostly selling online for now." "That sounds wonderful." I smiled. For the first time all evening, I felt seen. Not as Richard's wife, but as myself. I was about to tell her more when Richard suddenly appeared beside us, a wine glass in hand and a beaming smile on his face. "What are you ladies chatting about?" Catherine turned to him. "Oh, your wife was just telling me about her business." Richard immediately burst into laughter. It wasn't a polite chuckle. It was a booming, echoing laugh that drew the attention of nearby guests. "Oh, that—" My stomach tightened. I knew that tone all too well. Several people looked over at us. Richard took a sip of his wine, then uttered the words I will never forget. "My wife has a cute little hobby." A few people offered uncomfortable chuckles. I could feel my face burning as Richard pressed on. "You know how it is. Just a housewife earning a little pin money." A handful of guests laughed out loud. Not because it was genuinely funny, but because Richard was the boss. When powerful people laugh, others usually follow suit. I stood frozen as the laughter rippled through the group. One man even nodded and said, "Keeps her busy, right?" More laughter ensued. I wanted the floor to open up and swallow me whole. 35 years. 35 years of supporting this man. 35 years of sacrifice. And that was how he chose to describe the business I had built from scratch. A cute little hobby, housewife pin money. I forced myself to maintain a smile, knowing that if I cried, I would give them exactly what they expected. Weakness, embarrassment, and proof that I couldn't handle a joke. But deep inside, something fractured. It wasn't my confidence or my business. It was the illusion that Richard respected me. In that exact moment, I realized he didn't respect me at all. Perhaps he never had. Catherine didn't laugh. I noticed that immediately. While everyone else chuckled and moved on, she stood perfectly still, watching, listening, and taking in the entire dynamic. Her expression remained completely unreadable, and somehow that made me feel a little less alone. The conversation quickly shifted to corporate topics. Revenue projections, investments, market trends, all the things Richard loved to talk about. I quietly excused myself and walked toward the kitchen. The moment I was alone, I pressed both hands against the counter. My chest ached. I stared into the sink and took a few deep breaths. I didn't cry, at least not yet, but I was incredibly close to the edge. A few minutes later, Sarah Mitchell arrived. She was one of the few personal friends I had invited. The moment she saw my face, she knew something was terribly wrong. "What happened?" I tried to smile. "Nothing, Sarah." I turned my face away, but Sarah lowered her voice. "What did Richard do?" The fact that she could guess the culprit instantly spoke volumes. I briefly explained what had happened in the dining room, and her expression darkened significantly. "He said that in front of everyone." I nodded. Sarah shook her head. "That wasn't a joke, Deborah. That was humiliation." I didn't answer because she was right, and hearing it out loud somehow made reality cut even deeper. The rest of the dinner party passed by in a complete blur. I smiled when I needed to smile, served food, cleared plates, and poured wine, playing the exact role expected of me. Meanwhile, Richard continued to entertain his guests, as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred, as if he hadn't just publicly minimized years of my hard work into a punchline. Around 10 o'clock, the party finally began to wind down. Guests gathered their coats and said their goodbyes. I stood near the front door, thanking everyone for coming as they filed out one by one. Finally, Catherine approached, carrying her purse and car keys. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she reached into her bag, pulled out a business card, and handed it to me. I looked down at the simple, elegant card, Catherine Brooks. There was a title beneath her name, but before I could read it, she spoke. "Give me a call when you're ready." I blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" A faint smile appeared on her face. "I think you know exactly what I mean. I felt entirely out of the loop. Had I missed something? Her expression softened. No, she said, glancing toward the living room where Richard was laughing with another executive. She looked back at me. I've spent 30 years investing in businesses. I stared at her. Investing. Suddenly the card in my hand felt much heavier. Catherine continued. And I've learned one very important thing. I waited for her next words. She lowered her voice slightly. The people everyone else overlooks are usually the ones most worth watching. For a few seconds, neither of us said a word. Then she smiled, a genuine smile that reached all the way to her eyes. Call me Deborah. With that, she walked out the door and disappeared into the night. I stood there completely still, watching the darkness where she had been. A strange sensation washed over me. For the first time since being humiliated that evening, I felt an unexpected glimmer of hope. I looked down at the business card once more. I still didn't fully know who Catherine Brooks was, but my gut told me that meeting her was no accident. As I would soon find out, that tiny piece of paper was about to completely alter the trajectory of my life. Meanwhile, upstairs in his home office, Richard was celebrating what he believed to be another highly successful dinner party. He had absolutely no idea that while he was busy mocking my small business, someone far more powerful than either of us had just taken a keen interest in it. I spent nearly an hour staring at Catherine Brooks' business card after the party ended. The house was finally quiet. The dishes were done, the guests were gone, and Richard had gone up to his office, where he routinely stayed up late, reviewing corporate reports and replying to emails. As for me, I sat alone at the kitchen table with the card resting next to a cup of cold tea. I picked it up, set it down, and picked it up again. Part of me wanted to call her immediately, while another part was absolutely terrified. People like Catherine Brooks didn't just walk into the lives of women like me. At least that's what I had always believed. Successful investors spoke with CEOs, founders and executives, not 62-year-old women making candles in their garages. Ultimately, I slipped the card into my wallet and went to bed, but sleep refused to come. Richard's laughter kept playing on a loop in my mind. My wife has a cute little hobby. The phrase echoed over and over again. At 2 a.m, I finally sat up in bed and looked over at Richard. He was fast asleep beside me, completely peaceful and utterly unaffected. It was as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't humiliated me in front of a room full of people. That night, something fundamental shifted inside me. It wasn't anger or a desire for revenge. It was something much more powerful. Clarity. For decades, I had poured my energy into trying to earn Richard's approval. Maybe it was time to stop. Maybe it was time to focus on earning my own. The next morning, after Richard left for work, I dialed Catherine's number. I fully expected to get a voicemail, but she answered on the very first ring. Deborah, I blinked. You knew it was me? She let out a soft laugh. I've been expecting your call. Her unwavering confidence brought a smile to my face. For the next 30 minutes, we talked. Not about Richard and not about the dinner party, but strictly about business. It was the first time anyone had asked such serious questions about my company. Revenue, customer acquisition, production, profit margins, and growth. As the conversation drew to a close, Catherine completely caught me off guard. I'd like to come see your base of operations. I nearly laughed out loud. Base of operations? You mean my business? It's just my garage. Then show me your garage. 3 days later, Catherine arrived. I had spent the entire morning cleaning, not because she expected perfection, but because I was incredibly nervous. The moment she stepped into the garage, she began inspecting everything with an analytical eye. The shelves, the inventory, the packaging, the product labels. She asked dozens of targeted questions, and I answered every single one of them. After nearly an hour, she crossed her arms and looked around. Do you know what your biggest problem is? I swallowed hard. What? You're still treating this like a hobby. The comment caught me completely off guard. I don't understand. Deborah, your products are excellent. I blinked in surprise. Really? They are beyond excellent, she said, picking up one of my candles. But your branding doesn't match the quality. That afternoon turned into my very first real business lesson. Catherine explained concepts to me that no one had ever taught me before. Packaging psychology, customer perception, brand positioning, online marketing, product photography, and target demographics. I filled pages upon pages of a notebook with her insights. Before leaving, she looked at me with absolute seriousness. If you're willing to put in the work, this can become a much larger enterprise. My heart began to race. How large?
She smiled. Let's find out.
That conversation changed everything. Over the next few months, I stopped viewing my business as a side project and began treating it like a real company. Every morning, I woke up with a clear sense of purpose. Instead of watching television in the afternoons, I took online marketing courses. I studied e-commerce, social media strategies, search engine optimization, and email marketing. Some of it was overwhelming, but most of it was exhilarating. For the first time in years, my mind felt fully alive.
Sarah noticed the change immediately. One afternoon, she dropped by while I was working on redesigning my product labels.
You look different, she noted. I smiled. Different how? Happier? I looked at my computer screen. Maybe she was right. For years, I had focused entirely on everyone else's needs. Now, I was finally investing in myself. The results materialized much faster than I ever anticipated. Traffic to my website increased. Online orders doubled and then tripled. Glowing customer reviews began rolling in, and many buyers became repeat customers. One woman ordered gifts for her entire office, while another placed a massive order for her daughter's wedding. Every single order felt like validation, proof that my work had value and that I was capable. Richard barely noticed, or at least he pretended not to. Whenever he saw me working late into the night, he would just shake his head.
Still playing the entrepreneur game, I see.
I stopped arguing back. My silence seemed to confuse him more than any debate ever could, because I no longer needed him to believe in me. I finally believed in myself.
One evening, as I was packing shipments, Richard walked into the garage. His eyes swept across the shelves, taking in the significantly larger volume of products, inventory, boxes, and supplies.
He frowned. You're spending a lot of money. It's an investment. He smirked. That's exactly what people say, right before they lose everything. I kept packing. There was no reaction, no defense, and no explanation from my end. Richard seemed slightly disappointed by my lack of engagement. He lingered for another moment before walking away. The second he disappeared, I smiled. For the first time in my life, his opinion hadn't ruined my day. A few weeks later, Catherine called. Are you sitting down? My stomach immediately tightened with anxiety. What's wrong? I showed your products to someone. I froze. To whom? Ethan Parker. The name meant nothing to me. She continued, He handles purchasing for a regional chain of boutique stores. My heart started pounding against my ribs. I sat down slowly. What did he say? He wants samples. For a few seconds, I couldn't form a sentence. Samples. It wasn't a guaranteed order or a contract, just samples. Yet somehow it felt monumental. It meant a major player in the industry was paying attention to me. Over the next week, I worked harder than I ever had before. Every candle had to be absolutely flawless, every label perfectly straight, and every package pristine. I shipped the samples out and waited. Then came the agonizing waiting period. Every morning I checked my email, only to find nothing. Every afternoon I refreshed my inbox, still nothing. 2 weeks passed, then 3. I began to convince myself that the opportunity had slipped away. Maybe the products weren't good enough. Maybe I wasn't good enough. Maybe Richard had been right all along. And then the email arrived. I was standing in the kitchen when my phone buzzed. With trembling hands, I opened the message. The email was from Ethan Parker. He thanked me for sending the samples and praised the quality, the packaging presentation, the unique scents, and the overall customer experience. Then I read the final paragraph. I read it twice, then 3 times, and then a 4th, unable to believe my own eyes. His company wanted to place an initial trial order, a real, substantial order. It was the largest single order my business had ever received. I sat down heavily at the kitchen table, tears streaming down my face. They weren't tears of sadness, but of pure relief that someone believed in what I had built. For a long time, I just stared out the window, remembering every joke, every dismissive comment, and every single moment I had doubted myself. In an instant, all of that negativity felt completely insignificant. I almost told Richard that night. Almost. But something stopped me. An instinct, a sudden feeling that this achievement belonged entirely to me first, before anyone else. So, I kept the news to myself, at least for that evening. As the sun set behind the trees outside our house, I sat alone in the garage, surrounded by candles, shipping cartons, and a dream that was finally taking concrete shape. For the first time, I could visualize a future that went beyond just getting by, a future built on limitless possibilities. What I didn't know at the time was that just as my business was gearing up for its biggest opportunity yet, Richard's company was quietly sliding toward a major financial disaster. Very soon, the cracks in his empire would become impossible for him to ignore. The first sign of trouble at Richard's company appeared on a Monday morning. It seemed minor at the time, just a tiny hairline fracture that was easy to overlook. But sometimes, disasters announce themselves very quietly before they hit. Richard sat at the breakfast table, staring intently at his phone. Usually our mornings followed a highly predictable routine. Coffee, financial news, emails, and then off to work. But that morning felt entirely different. His jaw was clenched tight, his coffee sat completely untouched, and his eyes scanned the exact same message over and over again. I noticed it immediately. After 35 years of marriage, you learn to read the subtle shifts in a person's mood, even when they're trying desperately to hide it. "Is everything okay?" I asked. Richard snapped his head up way too quickly. "Fine." Then he went right back to his phone, effectively ending the conversation. I didn't push. I had learned a long time ago that Richard hated discussing problems, especially when he didn't have an immediate solution. A few minutes later, he grabbed his briefcase and headed for the door. Just as he was leaving, his phone rang. He answered it instantly. His voice dropped to a low whisper, and the expression on his face shifted to something serious, worried, and anxious. From the kitchen window, I watched him stand by his car, talking on the phone for nearly 10 minutes. When he finally drove away, a strange, uneasy feeling settled deep in my stomach. Something was wrong. I couldn't explain exactly why, but I just knew. Over the next few weeks, the changes became increasingly obvious. Richard started coming home later and later, sometimes after 9, sometimes after 10, and occasionally past midnight. Whenever I asked where he had been, the answer was always a terse single word. Work. No details, no explanations, just work. At first I believed him, but then I began to pay closer attention. His behavior grew more and more erratic. He would fly off the handle over insignificant things, forget entire conversations, and become easily irritated. One evening, while unloading the dishwasher, I accidentally broke a wine glass. The sound of shattering glass brought Richard rushing into the kitchen, and his reaction completely shocked me. "Can't you be more careful?" he snapped. I stared at him. "What?"
"You heard me." His voice was sharp, cutting, and entirely disproportionate to a broken glass.
For a few seconds, neither of us said a word. Then he turned on his heel and walked away without an apology or an attempt to smooth things over. I stood there holding a dish towel, staring down at the shards of glass, completely bewildered. The man I had married was always ambitious, sometimes arrogant, and occasionally thoughtless, but this felt entirely different. This felt like immense pressure, as if something were closing in on him from all sides, and he was losing the ability to hide it. Meanwhile, my own business continued its steady growth. The trial order for Ethan Parker's company had performed even better than expected. Customers loved the products, and items were selling out faster than anticipated across multiple locations. New orders began rolling in on a regular basis. For the first time in my life, I was generating a steady, substantial income. It wasn't life-changing wealth yet, but it was real, meaningful money that I had earned all on my own. I wanted to celebrate, but I found myself hiding my excitement because every success of mine seemed to agitate Richard. One evening, I tried to share a small victory. "By the way, Ethan called today." Richard didn't even look up from his laptop. "Who?" "The purchasing director." "Oh, they're looking into expanding our order." His fingers paused briefly over the keyboard, then resumed typing. "That's nice." The words sounded completely hollow and forced. I could hear the absolute insincerity in his voice. "That's it?" I asked. Richard sighed heavily. "What do you want me to say, Deborah?" I blinked. "I don't know." He slammed his laptop shut. "Deborah, they're just candles." There it was again, that exact tone, that familiar minimization. It was as if every milestone I reached was inherently inferior to anything he accomplished. I nodded slowly and changed the subject, but the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Richard didn't want me to succeed. He really didn't. He needed me to stay small, safe, and entirely dependent on him. A few days later, Sarah Mitchell dropped by unannounced. We sat on the back patio, drinking iced tea, and as usual, she picked up on the details I had missed. "Richard seems incredibly stressed," she noted. I let out a faint chuckle. "That's one way to put it." Her expression turned serious. "No, Deborah. I mean, he looks really stressed." I frowned. "What do you mean?" Sarah leaned forward. "My cousin works at his firm." My stomach tightened instantly. "What did she say?" "Nothing specific," Sarah hesitated, which somehow made me even more anxious. "But people are very nervous." I stared at her. "Nervous how? Rumours of layoffs, budget cuts, delayed projects?" Those words landed heavily. Richard hadn't mentioned a single thing about any of this. Not once. "Maybe they're just rumours," I suggested. Sarah didn't look convinced. Maybe. But neither of us truly believed that. The conversation echoed in my mind for days, and the more I thought about it, the more the pieces began to fit together. The late nights, the volatile temper, the secretive phone calls, and the constant tension. Maybe Richard wasn't just having a stressful month. Maybe something much larger was unfolding. Then the first undeniable confirmation arrived during dinner. Richard's phone rang. He glanced at the screen, and his face instantly hardened. Without a word, he stood up and left the room. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but his raised voice carried clearly from the hallway.
"No."
Silence. Then his tone grew sharper. "It is completely unacceptable." Another pause, and then, "We cannot afford to lose that account." My fork hovered in midair. Account. Lose. Those words reverberated in my mind. A few minutes later, Richard walked back into the dining room, his face completely pale. I had never seen him look like that in 35 years of marriage. "Is everything all right?" I asked cautiously. "It's nothing." The response came entirely too fast and sharp. I set my fork down. "Richard," I said, "it's nothing." The conversation was over, but the reality of the situation was becoming harder to mask. A week later, I discovered exactly how severe the situation was by pure accident. I happened to be driving past Richard's office building and decided to drop off a folder he had forgotten on the kitchen counter. Normally, I would just leave it with the front desk, but that day, the receptionist recognized me. "Mrs. Elliot, he's actually upstairs," she said with a polite smile. I thanked her and headed up to the executive floor. As I approached Richard's office, I heard voices. High-pitched, angry voices coming from the adjacent conference room, the door slightly ajar. I didn't mean to listen, but I couldn't help but hear. A man's voice snapped. "We lost that contract because you ignored every single warning sign." Another voice replied, "The board is looking for accountability." Then came Richard's voice, defensive and incredibly frustrated. "They're overreacting." A heavy silence followed, and then the other man spoke again. $3 million is not an overreaction, Richard." My heart skipped a beat. $3 million. I stood completely frozen outside the door as all the pieces clicked together. The stress, the mood swings, the secrecy. His company was in trouble. Massive trouble. Before anyone could spot me, I quietly turned around and walked away. The entire drive home felt completely surreal as I replayed the conversation over and over in my head. $3 million, a lost contract, board investigations. For decades, Richard had projected an image of absolute control, absolute success, and unshakable confidence. Now the cracks weren't just showing, they were widening rapidly. I watched him carefully that night. Richard looked entirely worn out, even older, carrying an palpable aura of defeat. It was as if the immense weight of his hidden reality was finally catching up to him. A part of me felt terrible for him, but another part felt a deep sense of confusion. If his company was struggling this badly, why wasn't he fixing it? Why wasn't he asking for help? Why was he continuing to pretend everything was completely fine? The answer revealed itself a few days later, and it changed absolutely everything. I learned that the contract his company had lost wasn't due to bad luck, shifting market conditions, or economic challenges. It was entirely Richard's own doing, a direct result of his arrogance, his refusal to listen to anyone else, and his firm belief that he was always the smartest person in the room. The very traits he used to mock in others had finally come back to haunt him. And though Richard didn't realize it yet, that lost contract was merely the beginning of the end. His empire was no longer just cracking. It was actively imploding. Ethan Parker's email arrived on a Wednesday morning. I must have read it 20 times, maybe more, unable to believe the words on the screen. His company wanted to place a significantly larger order. It wasn't a sample request or a small trial. It was a massive, serious commitment, the kind of order that could completely transform a small business overnight. I sat alone in my garage office, staring blankly at the figures. The total amount was greater than my entire sales volume from the previous 3 months combined. For a few minutes, I just wept silently at my desk. They were the kind of tears that come after you've spent years believing your dreams are too small to ever matter to anyone else. For the longest time, I had measured my success based on whether Richard validated it. Now, an influential buyer who had never even met me was validating my hard work. This felt completely real, entirely tangible, and uniquely mine. I immediately called Catherine, and she answered on the second ring. "You got the email," she stated flatly. I let out a tearful laugh. "How did you know?" "I know Ethan." My smile widened. "You knew this was going to happen." "I intended for it to happen," she corrected gently. I leaned back in my chair, overwhelmed. "Catherine, I don't even know what to say." "Save your thanks for when you're successful," she replied with a chuckle, before her tone turned serious. "Deborah." "Yes?" "This is just the beginning." Those words echoed in my mind long after the call ended. Just the beginning. For the first time in my life, I allowed myself to envision a future that went far beyond a side project or a hobby. I was running a company, a real, thriving company. Over the next 2 weeks, my life turned into a complete whirlwind. Production accelerated dramatically as I ordered more supplies, established demanding new schedules, and expanded my inventory. The garage could no longer easily contain everything. Boxes were stacked high against the walls, shelves were packed tight, and my desk was completely covered in shipping labels. Every single day was exhilarating, exhausting, and beautifully terrifying all at once. Success brought an entirely new set of responsibilities, risks, and expectations. But I loved every single minute of it. On a Friday afternoon, Ethan Parker called me directly, his voice warm and professional. "Deborah, I'd like to discuss the next phase," he said. My heart immediately began to race. "The next phase? We've received incredibly strong feedback from our customers." I smiled. "That's wonderful to hear." "It's more than just wonderful," Ethan clarified. "We're looking into expanding our distribution." For a moment, I lost my voice entirely as the phrase expanding distribution echoed in my mind. He continued, "We're looking to place your products into additional boutique locations across Ohio and the neighboring states." I stared out the garage window in disbelief. Ohio and neighboring states. Just months ago, I was selling candles to my immediate neighbors. Now, retail stores across multiple states wanted my products. The idea felt almost impossible to grasp. After the call ended, I sat in silence for a few minutes, soaking it all in. Then I made a decision that I probably shouldn't have made. I decided to tell Richard. A lingering part of me still wanted to share my success with my husband, holding on to a shred of hope. Richard arrived home around 7 that evening, looking completely drained. His tie was loosened, and he had dark circles under his eyes. The immense stress was impossible to hide, but I followed him into the kitchen anyway. "I received some incredible news today," I began. He opened the refrigerator, barely looking at me. "Uh-huh," Ethan called. That managed to catch his attention slightly. He closed the fridge door. "What about?" "They want to expand our distribution." Richard just stared at me. I waited, thinking that even he would realize how monumental this milestone was. Instead, he simply shrugged. "Okay."
I blinked in disbelief. "Okay, that's all you have to say?"
I felt a wave of deep disappointment wash over me. "This is a massive opportunity, Richard." "They're candles, Deborah." There it was again, that exact phrase, that cutting minimization. I felt all my excitement instantly drain away. "This could become a major regional brand," I pushed back. Richard let out a soft laugh. It wasn't cruel or booming this time, but somehow that made it cut even deeper. "A regional candle brand."
I just stared at him.
"Don't get carried away," he added dismissively. The room suddenly felt incredibly small. For a moment, neither of us said a word, and then I finally asked the question that had been haunting me for months. Why does my success bother you so much? Richard frowned. It doesn't. Then why do you always talk about it like it's completely insignificant? His expression hardened. I never said it was insignificant. But you act like it is every single time? A heavy silence filled the space between us until Richard finally shook his head. You're being entirely too sensitive. I let out a bitter laugh. That response was entirely too familiar. Whenever my feelings exposed an uncomfortable truth, I was always labelled as too sensitive, too emotional, or too dramatic. It was never justified, never fair, and always shifted the blame onto me. Before the conversation could escalate into a full argument, I turned and walked away. I lay awake in bed that night, unable to sleep as the reality became undeniable. Richard was not happy for me, and he wasn't even bothering to pretend anymore. Meanwhile, the strange occurrences surrounding his own company continued to mount. The following week, I attended a business networking luncheon that Catherine had recommended. It was my very first time participating in a professional event as an entrepreneur, and I felt incredibly nervous, out of place, and hit with a wave of imposter syndrome. Everyone else appeared so accomplished, experienced, and self-assured. Then I recalled what Catherine often told me. You belong in every room you walk into. Your hard work earned you that right. So I stayed, and I listened. During a conversation with a group of attendees, I happened to mention Richard's firm. The reaction I received completely caught me off guard. The woman I was speaking with hesitated for just a fraction of a second, but I caught it instantly. Is everything all right over there? I inquired gently. She forced a polite smile. Of course. Yet the energy in the conversation shifted dramatically. Later on, another attendee reacted the exact same way, followed by a third. A brief pause, an uncomfortable expression, and carefully guarded words, as if everyone knew a secret they weren't willing to share. The consistent pattern left me deeply unsettled. When I brought it up to Catherine later that day, she grew uncharacteristically quiet. What is it? I asked, sensing her hesitation. She sighed heavily. How much has Richard actually told you? My stomach instantly tightened with apprehension. About what? Catherine looked genuinely uncomfortable, which terrified me more than anything else. I assumed you knew. Knew what? She hesitated for another moment, then shook her head. It's not my place to say, Deborah. I stared at her intently. Catherine, please. She placed a reassuring hand on my arm. Just watch your back. Those 3 words remained etched in my mind. Watch your back. It wasn't an expression of support or comfort. It was an explicit warning. The days that followed were thick with tension. Richard became increasingly distant and detached. Phone calls constantly interrupted our dinners. Emails arrived at all hours of the night, and he spent the entire weekend locked away inside his home office. The palpable pressure surrounding him seemed to grow exponentially. One Sunday morning, I walked into the kitchen to find him staring blankly at piles of financial statements. His face was pale. He looked incredibly aged, and he carried an overwhelming aura of defeat. For a split second, I felt a flicker of genuine sympathy for him. Then he noticed me standing there. He immediately scrambled to shuffle the documents out of sight, putting his corporate mask back on. What do you want? He snapped, his sudden hostility catching me off guard. Nothing, I replied quietly. He packed up his reports into his briefcase. You don't need to concern yourself with any of this. I nodded slowly, but deep down I already knew. Whatever was unfolding was severe. Incredibly severe. The final piece of the puzzle arrived entirely out of nowhere. A few days later, Catherine invited me out for lunch. In the middle of our meal, she caught me off guard with a peculiar question. Do you know who originally approached Richard's company 2 years ago? I shook my head. Approached him about what? The same retail group that Ethan works with now? I frowned, confused. What about them? Catherine leaned back in her chair. They approached Richard first. I stared at her in disbelief. What? They wanted to form a major strategic partnership with his firm. Are you serious? She nodded, and Richard turned them down flat. The information hit me like a physical shock. Why on earth would he do that? Catherine's expression turned thoughtful. Because he deemed them too small to be worth his time. I sat there in absolute silence as the sheer irony of the situation washed over me. The very retail chain that was currently catapulting my business into regional distribution was the exact opportunity Richard had rejected years ago because it was too small, an opportunity that had since become massively successful. Catherine continued. A lot of people within his own firm strongly disagreed with that decision. A cold chill ran down my spine as another piece of the puzzle fell perfectly into place. The disastrous decisions, the lost contracts, the internal division, and the intense board pressure. It was all interconnected. For the first time in my life, I began to realize that the jeopardy Richard faced was far worse than anyone realized. While my company was finally rising, his was sinking rapidly into an abyss, and neither of us knew exactly how deep the water truly was. The day I discovered our life savings had been completely wiped out began exactly like any other. There was no warning, no frantic phone call, and no obvious sign that my entire reality was about to shatter. I was sitting at the kitchen table, paying the monthly household bills, a routine I had managed for decades. Richard always handled our investments in major corporate financial decisions, while I managed our day-to-day living expenses. It was an arrangement that had worked perfectly throughout most of our marriage, back when trust came easily, and back when I truly believed we were equal partners. As I was reviewing our account balances, I noticed an anomaly. One of our primary savings accounts looked significantly lower than usual. Considerably lower. At first I assumed I had simply made a mistake. Perhaps I misread the digital digits, or maybe a large automated payment had just cleared. I told myself there had to be a perfectly logical explanation. I logged into the portal and pulled up the detailed transaction history. My stomach instantly tied itself into a knot. Over the past 4 months, there had been a series of massive wire transfers, not one or two, but several, each moving tens of thousands of dollars out of the account. I stared blankly at the screen, convinced I was misinterpreting the statement. I refreshed the page and checked the numbers again, but they didn't change. Nearly $200,000 was completely gone. My hands began to shake violently, and for a few seconds, I couldn't even catch my breath. $200,000. The money we had spent decades carefully setting aside for our retirement, our safety net, and our collective future.
Vanished.
I immediately called the bank. The customer service representative confirmed every single transfer, stating that they were all fully authorized, entirely legal, and initiated directly by Richard. After the call ended, I sat frozen at my chair. I wasn't even angry yet. I was just consumed by an overwhelming sense of confusion and fear. Why hadn't he told me what was happening? The question looped endlessly in my mind all afternoon. By the time Richard walked through the door that evening, I had printed out every single transaction sheet. The papers were laid out neatly on the kitchen table, waiting for him, and so was I. The exact moment he stepped into the room, he knew he was caught. His eyes locked onto the documents, and his expression shifted instantly. It wasn't surprise. It was a look of cold recognition that terrified me more than anything else. He already knew exactly what I had uncovered. I stood up slowly. What happened to our savings, Richard?
For a long, agonizing moment, he said absolutely nothing. Then he casually loosened his tie, walked into the kitchen, and sat down. The utter casualness of his movement shocked me, as if we were about to discuss the evening weather rather than the destruction of our future.
Finally, he let out a heavy sigh. I was planning on telling you. I let out a short, bitter laugh. You mean you were planning on telling me once I caught you? His jaw clenched tightly. It was necessary, Deborah. I stared at him blankly. Necessary? What is that supposed to mean? Richard rubbed his temples. The company required some temporary capital to get through a rough patch. The words sounded entirely rehearsed and carefully prepared, as if he had been anticipating this exact confrontation for weeks. I felt a surge of hot anger rise up inside me. You took $200,000 of our personal money. I wasn't taking, he argued defensively. Then what do you call it? His voice hardened. I call it protecting our future. I blinked in utter disbelief. By wiping out our entire life savings? Richard leaned forward across the table. You don't understand the full scope of the situation. Then explain it to me. Help me understand. For a brief second, I thought he might actually open up. Instead, he looked away, and that silence told me everything I needed to know. People with legitimate reasons share them. People without them evade. Richard, I demanded. His eyes snapped back to mine. The firm is facing some serious challenges. Challenges. It was empty corporate jargon. Meaningless corporate nonsense executives use when they are entirely too proud to say the word failure. How bad is it? I asked plainly.
Sense.
Richard looked at me. How bad is it? It's worse than I anticipated, he finally admitted. The confession hit me like a physical blow. Not because of the words themselves, but because Richard Elliot never admitted to weakness. Never. Not once in 35 years of marriage. I sat back down slowly, feeling the weight of the moment. Exactly how much trouble are you in? His face darkened, the question clearly wounding his immense pride. I'm handling it. It is not what I asked you. The silence stretched out between us until he finally spoke again. We lost our primary anchor clients.
I nodded slowly, already knowing that much. And?
An even longer pause followed, and then, we've accumulated significant debt. My heart sank completely. How much debt? He refused to answer, and that silence was far more terrifying than any specific dollar amount could have ever been. The conversation dragged on for nearly an hour, with every answer exposing yet another layer of systemic failure. Lost contracts, plummeting revenues, intense pressure from creditors, board insubordination, and mounting liabilities. By the end of it, I barely recognized the thriving enterprise he had spent years bragging about. The empire he built wasn't just struggling, it was hemorrhaging cash, and no one seemed capable of stopping the bleeding, including Richard. The most painful part of the realization wasn't even the catastrophic financial loss, it was the profound deception. For months he had sat across from me, watching me plan our future retirement trips, home renovations, and college funds for our grandchildren, knowing full well that the money was already gone. That level of betrayal cut far deeper than the loss of any bank balance. Finally, I asked the single question that had been burning in my mind all evening. Why didn't you just talk to me? Why didn't you tell me? Richard didn't hesitate with his response. Because I knew you would panic. I stared at him for a long moment, and then I slowly nodded. There it was, the unvarnished truth. It wasn't an act of protection or love. It was a profound lack of respect. He hadn't kept me in the dark to spare my feelings. He did it because he never viewed me as an equal partner. He viewed me as someone who was simply supposed to trust him blindly, follow him unquestioningly, and accept whatever decisions he made. It was the exact same patronizing dynamic that had defined our entire marriage, only now the consequences were incredibly dangerous. The weeks that followed grew increasingly unbearable. Richard poured every single waking hour into a desperate attempt to salvage his firm. Meanwhile, I became utterly obsessed with understanding the true state of our financial affairs. The more documents I reviewed, the more discrepancies began to surface. Certain transactions made absolutely no logical sense. Files appeared incomplete, and critical details seemed intentionally obscured. One evening, while meticulously sorting through old tax records, I stumbled upon a folder I had never seen before. An unfamiliar file containing corporate financing agreements. At first glance, they appeared to have nothing to do with me, and then my eyes caught the name of my own business, typed clearly on the page. Elliot Home Sense. My pulse quickened instantly. I pulled the documents closer under the light, reading every single line, and then reading it again, thoroughly convinced I was misinterpreting the text. But I wasn't. The paperwork explicitly cited my business, its assets, its current revenue streams, and its projected market valuation. I flipped through the pages faster and faster, desperately searching for answers. Then I reached the final signature page. The blood in my veins turned entirely to ice. There, written clearly on the line, was my signature. Deborah Elliot. Signed, dated, and legally binding. The problem was terrifyingly simple. I had never signed that document. Never. I stared at the page, my mind entirely unable to process what I was looking at. The handwriting looked remarkably like my own, accurate enough to deceive a casual glance, or pass a routine inspection. But it wasn't mine. Absolutely not. A wave of physical nausea washed over me, and I sat completely motionless at the desk. The implications were chilling. Richard hadn't just hidden his financial downfall from me. He had actively entangled my independent business into his corporate liability without my knowledge, discussion, or consent. The moment he walked through the door that night, I confronted him immediately. I laid the document flat on the dining room table, and the exact second his eyes landed on it, all the colour drained from his face. For the first time in our entire life together, I saw a flash of genuine panic in his eyes. "What is this, Richard?" I asked, my voice deadly calm. He said nothing. "Richard, look at me. What is this?"
Still silence.
"What is this?" I raised my voice, demanding an answer. Finally he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "It was necessary."
I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Necessary. There was that word again. Always an excuse, never an ounce of accountability.
"You used my company," I said, the reality setting in. "It was just temporary collateral," he insisted. The entire room began to spin around me. Collateral. I repeated the word slowly, trying to force my brain to comprehend it. You put my business up as collateral for your debts. Just until the funding cleared," he pleaded. I let out a sharp laugh, a sound that shocked even me, completely devoid of humour and filled with pure disbelief. "You never even asked me." His expression instantly hardened into a defensive scowl. "We are married, Deborah. Everything we own belongs to both of us." I stared at him for a long, silent moment. That single statement exposed absolutely everything about his worldview. To Richard, marriage didn't mean a partnership. It meant ownership, access, and total control. He genuinely believed that my success belonged to him. My business belonged to him. My hard work belonged to him. And my entire future was his to gamble with. Because of that arrogance, he had crossed a dangerous legal line. A line from which I wasn't sure our marriage could ever recover. Late that night, long after Richard had gone upstairs to bed, I sat alone out in the garage. I looked around at the shelves filled with the products I had created through years of relentless effort, sacrifice, and determination. Built during a time when absolutely no one else, including my husband, believed in me. For the first time since starting this journey, I wasn't thinking about growth metrics, profit margins, or market expansion. My mind was focused entirely on protection, because a realization had finally solidified deep within me. Richard wasn't just struggling anymore, he was completely cornered, and desperate people make incredibly dangerous choices. As I sat there staring down at the forged signature on the paperwork, a terrifying question began to echo in the silence of my mind. If Richard was willing to exploit my business without my permission, what else had he done that I had yet to discover? I didn't sleep a single wink the night I uncovered that document. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see that forged signature staring back at me. A clever imitation of my name that I had never actually written. For decades, I had willingly handed over control of everything most married couples manage together to Richard. Our finances, investments, retirement strategies, and major life decisions. I used to believe that mutual trust was the very foundation of a marriage. Now I was left wondering if we had any foundation left at all. At 3 a.m, I got out of bed and quietly walked downstairs. The house was pitch black, silent, and freezing cold. I sat at the kitchen table and spread out the corporate documents once more under the soft overhead light. The figures looked even more catastrophic than they had before. Collateral agreements, financing liabilities, and corporate valuations. I couldn't fully comprehend all the complex legal jargon. However, one reality was absolutely undeniable. My independent business was now legally tethered to Richard's failing corporate debts, and I had never given my consent. The realization made my stomach churn with anxiety. If his empire went under, would it drag mine down with it? The terrifying question consumed me all through the following day. By afternoon, I knew I could no longer handle this alone. I needed professional counsel. Not from Richard, not from mutual friends, but from an expert who understood the law. Someone who could tell me exactly how much danger I was in. Which is how 2 days later, I found myself sitting across a desk from Melissa Carter. Sarah had recommended her to me. "She's incredibly sharp," Sarah had said, "and she doesn't back down for anyone." At that moment, both of those qualities sounded exactly like what I needed. Melissa's office was located in downtown Columbus. She was in her late 40s with a piercing gaze, a calm demeanour, and a refreshing lack of corporate sugarcoating. Within 5 minutes, I liked her. Within 10, I trusted her completely. I handed her the stack of files, and she began to read through them slowly and methodically, occasionally making brief notations on a pad. The longer she reviewed the pages, the graver her expression became, which only amplified my internal panic. After nearly 30 minutes, she finally looked up and met my gaze. "Tell me everything from the very beginning." So, I did. I told her about the emptied savings accounts, the systemic collapse of Richard's firm, the missing funds, the collateral agreements, and his decades of absolute financial control. I laid out every single detail. Melissa listened intently, never once interrupting me. When I finally finished speaking, she leaned back in her leather chair. "Deborah, I need to ask you a very direct question," she said. "Okay." "Did you sign any of these documents? Any of them at all?" "No, not a single one." "Are you absolutely certain?" "I am completely certain," I replied, without a shred of doubt.
She nodded slowly, her expression confirming what she had already suspected. I felt my pulse quicken. "What is it? What does this mean?"
Melissa clasped her hands together on the desk. "The very first thing we need to do is insulate your business. No investigations, no discussions. Pure protection." The word immediately triggered a wave of alarm. "Protect it from what?" She looked me dead in the eye. "Potential liability for his debts." My mouth went completely dry. "How bad is it, Melissa?" Her response was chillingly direct. "It could be catastrophic for your company." The room suddenly felt suffocatingly small, and I gripped the armrests of my chair to steady myself. Melissa continued, "It appears your husband has claimed your business as an asset connected to his personal corporate financing agreements." I swallowed hard. "Meaning what exactly?" "Meaning his creditors could argue that your company's revenue is legally fair game to satisfy the debts his firm has incurred." The explanation hit me like a physical blow. My business, the enterprise I had built from absolutely nothing, the company that was finally on the verge of massive success, could be completely dismantled to cover Richard's disastrous failures. For a long moment, I couldn't even form a sentence. Melissa waited patiently until I finally managed to find my voice. "What do I need to do?" For the first time since I walked into her office, a faint smile appeared on her face. "We build a wall between you and him." That directive became our absolute focus over the next several weeks, creating legal distance, financial separation, and an ironclad paper trail of protection. Melissa worked with meticulous precision, and every single meeting felt like a masterclass in business management, revealing risks I hadn't even considered. First, we thoroughly audited my ownership records. Then we moved on to my commercial bank accounts, tax filings, business registrations, vendor contracts, and supplier agreements. Anything and everything that definitively established Elliott HomeSense as a completely independent legal entity. The process was utterly exhausting, but it was also incredibly empowering. For the first time in my life, I understood every single facet of my own company's inner workings, every account, every asset, and every legal obligation. The business no longer felt like a hobby to me. It felt entirely real, because it was real. Following Melissa's advice, I opened entirely new commercial bank accounts that were completely uncoupled from our personal marital finances. I routed all future corporate revenues into those accounts and documented every single transaction with extreme precision. The more control I regained, the stronger I felt. For decades, I had relied entirely on Richard to manage our financial world. Now I was learning to master it myself. The profound realization brought a wave of self-confidence that completely surprised me.
One afternoon, after an exceptionally productive session, I sat in my car outside Melissa's office and actually smiled. It wasn't because my circumstances had magically resolved, but because I finally felt capable of handling whatever came next.
And then, the moment that changed absolutely everything arrived. It happened during our 4th scheduled meeting. Melissa had requested additional copies of the financing agreements, which I had retrieved and handed over to her that morning. She spent nearly an hour comparing signatures, analyzing pages, and examining the fine print. Eventually, she went completely silent. The abrupt shift in her energy caught my attention immediately. What is it? Did you find something? Melissa didn't answer right away. She kept her eyes fixed on one page, then compared it to another, and then another. Finally, she looked up at me. Deborah, she said, her voice carrying a weight that made my heart drop. Can I see your driver's license? I blinked, thoroughly confused. My driver's license? Why? Despite my bewilderment, I pulled it out of my wallet and handed it over. She placed the card directly next to the signature on one of the corporate financing documents, comparing the two carefully several times. A heavy silence filled the office. I watched her expression slowly and deliberately shift until my stomach tied itself into a knot. Melissa, please tell me what's going on, I urged. She set both the license and the document down on her desk, taking a slow, deep breath. Are you absolutely 100% certain you didn't sign this agreement?
I stared at her. I am absolutely certain. There is no doubt in my mind. I know my own signature.
Melissa nodded slowly and then uttered the words that shattered everything. I don't think you signed it either. The room went completely still. For a second, I wasn't even sure I had processed her words correctly. Then the full weight of her implication hit me like a tidal wave. Are you saying you think he forged my name? Melissa chose her words with extreme legal caution. I'm saying there are significant, undeniable discrepancies between your actual signature and the one on this document.
I felt a sudden wave of dizziness wash over me. Real, physical vertigo. I reached out and gripped the edge of her desk as my entire body went numb. Because until that exact second, a buried part of me was still desperately holding on to the hope that this was all just a massive misunderstanding, a clerical error, or a simple mistake.
Now that hope was completely gone. The reality facing me was infinitely worse. This wasn't a case of administrative carelessness or poor communication. This wasn't just a husband making terrible financial decisions. This was something much darker, much more calculated. I sat staring blankly at the document, at the forged ink, at the undeniable proof of betrayal. In an instant, 35 years of marriage felt completely foreign to me. Who was this man I had shared a life with for over 3 decades? The drive home felt entirely endless as my mind raced with millions of questions, memories, conversations, excuses, and lies. How much else had Richard hidden from me over the years? How many decisions had he made behind my back? How many boundaries had he crossed simply because he assumed he had the absolute right to do so? By the time I pulled into the driveway, I was emotionally hollowed out. The garage once again became my sanctuary, and I sat down amidst the shelves of candles and packaging supplies. The familiar, comforting scent of lavender enveloped me, but it brought no relief that day. Instead, I was consumed by a completely new emotion. Fear. Not a fear of business failure, but a profound terror of what other dark secrets might be waiting to be uncovered. Because if Melissa was correct, if Richard had actually forged my name on legal financial documents, then the situation went far beyond hidden corporate debt or a struggling company. It meant the man I had trusted implicitly for 35 years had crossed a major legal line. Deep down, a sinking feeling told me this was only the beginning. Desperate people rarely stop at just one reckless act, and Richard Elliott was becoming increasingly desperate. The collapse of Richard's company stopped being a private crisis on a rainy Tuesday morning. Up until that point, the damage had been successfully contained behind closed doors, confined to boardroom confrontations, emergency legal huddles, and frantic financial restructurings. The insiders knew the situation was dire, while the outside world merely suspected it. That all changed the moment the first media report went live. I was sitting in the kitchen, drinking my morning coffee, when Sarah called, her voice strained and urgent. Deborah, have you seen the news yet? My stomach dropped instantly. No, why? What happened? Open your laptop right now. The second the call ended, I opened my computer. There on the screen was a prominent local business publication, featuring a headline that was impossible to miss. Columbus Packaging Group faces escalating financial crises. I stared at the text for a second before my eyes scanned the article. The report explicitly cited widespread instances of non-payment to suppliers, a string of catastrophic contract losses, a severe liquidity crisis, intense criticism of upper management, and internal chaos described by anonymous corporate sources. There hadn't been an official bankruptcy declaration just yet, but anyone with a basic understanding of business could see exactly where the ship was heading. The article was a flashing red warning sign.
For several minutes, I just sat there, completely motionless. It wasn't out of shock, but rather the sobering realization that seeing it in print made the nightmare undeniably real. The crisis was no longer confined to whispers or private confrontations. The entire city now knew his empire was crumbling.
When Richard came downstairs a short while later, he looked utterly defeated. I had never seen a human being age so rapidly. The dark circles under his eyes were deep, and his shoulders were permanently hunched forward under the weight of tension. I watched him pour a cup of coffee before asking quietly, "Did you read the article this morning?" His hand paused for a fraction of a second over the pot before he finished pouring. "I saw it," he replied flatly. That was it. No explanation, no outrage, no denial. He just stood there, staring down into his mug. "And the media doesn't have the facts straight," he added defensively, the words sounding completely empty, like a scripted line from a politician or an executive whose secrets had just been exposed to the world. "Which part did they get wrong, Richard?" I asked calmly. His jaw clenched tightly. "All of it." I gave a slow, silent nod and went back to my coffee. The conversation was over, but the suffocating tension remained thick in the air all day long. Over the weeks that followed, more articles surfaced, with each new report unearthing even more damaging details. Payment defaults, legal disputes with major vendors, sudden contract cancellations, internal insubordination, and a mass exodus of key staff. With every passing headline, the inevitable conclusion became clearer. I could see how much Richard utterly loathed the coverage. Each new article made him noticeably more volatile, intensely defensive, and increasingly unpredictable. Meanwhile, my own business continued to thrive. Ethan's regional distribution rollout had launched with massive success. My products were hitting the shelves of new boutique locations, and order volumes surged once again. For the very first time, I actually had to hire part-time assistants, a lovely retired woman from our neighborhood named Carol. The decision felt completely surreal to me. I had an employee, me, the woman whose husband had dismissed her hard work as nothing more than a cute little hobby just a short time ago. One afternoon, while Carol was helping me prep a large shipment, my phone rang. It was Catherine. "How are you holding up through all of this?" she asked gently. I knew exactly what she was referring to. "The business is doing exceptionally well," I countered softly. "And how is Richard?" I looked out the window, choosing my words with extreme care. "I don't even recognize him anymore, Catherine." A heavy silence followed before Catherine sighed softly. "Success has a way of hiding a person's deepest flaws, Deborah." "What do you mean by that?" "I mean, some people appear incredibly strong and capable, right up until the exact moment they are tested." Those words remained with me long after our conversation ended, because Richard was being tested, and he was failing catastrophically, not just financially, but structurally as a man. The financial collapse hadn't changed him. It had simply stripped away the facade to reveal who he had always been underneath. The true crisis wasn't the millions of dollars in corporate debt. It was his utter inability to take responsibility for his own actions. Every single setback was always someone else's fault. The shifting economy, changing market trends, incompetent staff, aggressive competitors, or difficult vendors. Everyone was to blame, except the man who made the decisions. One evening, the reality became impossible to ignore. Richard stormed into the house. It wasn't just stress or frustration. It was pure, unadulterated rage. He slammed the front door so hard the walls rattled. I looked up from the kitchen table and instantly knew something was wrong. He threw his briefcase onto a chair and roughly loosened his tie. "Unbelievable," he muttered. I kept my voice calm. "What happened?" Richard let out a bitter laugh. "The vultures." I frowned. "What?" "The journalists," he said, pacing back and forth across the kitchen. "Suddenly everyone's an expert."
His anger seemed entirely out of proportion, as if the news articles weren't the real issue, as if something much worse had happened. Then he turned to face me, and the entire atmosphere shifted.
"You know what the funniest part is?" he asked. The question caught me off guard. "What?" "You've never supported me." I stared at him, convinced I had misheard. "What did you say?" He narrowed his eyes. "You heard me?" For a moment, I couldn't even speak. After everything we had been through, after decades of sacrifice, raising our children, supporting his career, building our home, and standing by him through every single challenge. This was his conclusion, that I had never supported him. The accusation felt absurd, cruel, and completely detached from reality. "What are you talking about?" I asked.
Richard shook his head. "You've always only cared about your little business."
I blinked. "My business?" "Yes," he said, the anger rising in his voice. While I was dealing with real matters, the words hung in the air, heavy, ugly, and incredibly revealing. Real matters. There it was again. The same deep-seated belief, the same arrogance. My work didn't matter. My struggles didn't matter. My achievements didn't matter. Everything I built had to exist beneath him. For the first time in my life, I didn't stay silent. I stood up slowly, deliberately, and looked him dead in the eye. "My business is real." Richard laughed. That laugh instantly took me back to that awful dinner party, the humiliation, the public mockery. Something inside me hardened. My business pays its own bills.
His smile vanished.
My business is growing. Silence. And my business doesn't rely on other people's savings to survive. The words hit him like a physical blow. Richard's face turned bright red. I knew I had struck a nerve. Neither of us said another word. Richard grabbed his briefcase and walked out of the room. The conversation was over, but the damage was done. A few days later, the unexpected happened. I received a call from Linda Foster, one of my suppliers. We had been working together for nearly a year. She supplied several of the fragrance ingredients I used regularly. Usually, our conversations were strictly professional. Inventories, shipping schedules, and new products. This call felt different. "Deborah, do you have a moment?" Her tone immediately sparked concern. "Of course." Linda hesitated, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I need to ask you something." My stomach tightened. "What is it?" "Are you and Richard Elliott still married?" The question caught me completely by surprise. "Yes, we are." A heavy silence followed. Then she spoke. "I was afraid of that." A chill ran through me. "What's wrong?" Linda let out a long sigh. "My company is one of the vendors his business owes money to." I closed my eyes. Of course. Another unpaid supplier, another broken relationship, another consequence of his choices. "I am so sorry," I whispered. "I'm not calling about the money," she said, and the seriousness in her voice made me sit up straight. "What do you mean?" Another pause. Then, choosing her words carefully, Linda said, "Some things just aren't adding up." My pulse quickened. "Like what?" "I can't explain everything over the phone." An unfamiliar anxiety gripped my chest. Real apprehension. Linda sounded like someone who held critical information, but wasn't sure how to share it. "Linda." "Yes?" "What are you trying to tell me?" Her answer was soft, almost reluctant. "I think you need to look at some documents." The room suddenly felt cold. Documents. The word instantly made me think of Melissa. The signatures, the financing agreements, and the secrets.
I gripped the phone tightly. "What kind of documents?"
Linda hesitated one last time before delivering the words that would change everything. "The kind that might explain why Richard is acting like a man with his back against the wall." After the call ended, I sat alone in my garage, staring blankly ahead, processing everything. The newspaper articles, the mounting debts, the accusations, the questioned signatures. And now, documents held by an unpaid supplier. The pieces were starting to form a larger, much darker picture.
For the first time in my life, I began to wonder if Richard's financial trouble was only part of the story. Because desperation leaves a trail, and those tracks were leading somewhere I wasn't sure I wanted to go.
3 days after that phone call, I met with Linda Foster. The entire drive to her office, I kept asking myself the same question. How much worse could this get? By then, I knew Richard had drained our personal savings. I knew he had listed my business as collateral. I knew Melissa suspected my signature had been forged, and I knew his company was publicly falling apart. Logically, it felt like hit rock bottom. I was wrong. Linda owned a boutique fragrance supply company in North Columbus. When I arrived, she greeted me warmly, but I immediately noticed the tension in her face. She looked uneasy, almost reluctant, as if she wished she didn't have to hold this meeting. We sat down in a small conference room. On the table between us lay a manila folder. My eyes locked onto it instantly. The documents. Linda clasped her hands together. Before I show you this, I need you to understand something.
I nodded. Okay.
I'm not trying to hurt you. The statement made my stomach drop. I know, she sighed heavily, her expression turning somber. I considered staying out of this, but you deserve to know the truth. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she opened the folder. Inside were invoices, emails, financial ledgers, and correspondence with other vendors. Most of it looked standard, until she pointed to a few highlighted sections. This is where things stopped making sense? I leaned in to read closely. The more I read, the more confused I became. Multiple suppliers had been promised payments, only to be delayed again and again. The explanations shifted constantly. Cash flow issues, temporary restructurings, administrative errors. Every excuse was different, but the outcome was identical. No one was getting paid. I looked up. Why are you showing me this? Linda hesitated, then slid another document across the table. Look at this one. The moment I saw Richard's signature, my chest tightened. I kept reading down the page, and near the middle, my heart stopped. The name of my company was right there. Elliott Home Fragrances. I stared at the paper, completely speechless. Linda nodded slowly. Yes, I could barely find my voice. What is this? A financing proposal. I leaned closer. The proposal cited the projected revenue of my business, future growth estimates, potential asset values. Information Richard had absolutely no right to possess. Information I had never authorized him to use. My heart raced. He submitted this. Linda nodded. Months ago. A wave of nausea washed over me. It wasn't because of the numbers. It was because of what it revealed. Richard wasn't acting on impulse. This wasn't a desperate last-minute decision. This was a pattern. A deliberate, calculated pattern. For months he had been leveraging my company behind my back. For months he had been making decisions without my knowledge, risking everything I had built. I leaned back in my chair, trying to process the scale of the betrayal. Linda spoke softly. There's more. My stomach sank. Of course there was. There was always more. She handed me a few printed emails involving lenders, consultants, and financial advisors. I scanned the pages quickly until one sentence stopped me completely. If assets under the spouse's name can be secured as additional collateral. I read it twice, then a third time. My hands began to shake. Richard had never viewed my company as an independent entity separate from his problems. He saw it as a solution, an asset, a resource to be sacrificed to save himself.
Suddenly, I understood why he reacted so negatively to my success. Why he mocked it, why he minimized it, why he refused to celebrate it. He didn't see it as mine. He saw it as his backup plan, a financial lifeboat.
The realization cut deeper than I expected. After 35 years of marriage, I wanted to believe that beneath the arrogance, there was still some shred of respect. Beneath the control, some appreciation. Now I wasn't so sure. As the meeting ended, Linda gently touched my arm. I'm so sorry.
I nodded, entirely at a loss for words.
The drive home felt endless. My mind raced, each new revelation painting the exact same picture. Richard was cornered, far more desperate than he would ever admit, far more desperate than anyone realized. That night, I called Melissa. By the next morning, I was sitting in her office again, with the new documents spread across her desk. She reviewed them methodically, occasionally making notes before finally leaning back. Her expression was grave. Deborah, I already know I don't like what's coming next. Yes, you were absolutely right to bring these to me. My heart sank. How bad is it? Melissa crossed her hands. The good news is we've already started the process of separating your business entity. I nodded. The bad news is it appears Richard has repeatedly overstepped his authority regarding your company.
I closed my eyes for a moment, overwhelmed by sheer exhaustion. I was so tired. Tired of the surprises, tired of the secrets, and tired of discovering new ways my trust had been compromised.
We need to move quickly, Melissa continued. That became our sole focus, acting fast to protect the business, secure the assets, preserve the evidence, and protect me. Over the next few weeks, my life split into two completely different realities. One world was thriving, while the other was crumbling to pieces. My business continued to grow. Ethan called regularly with positive updates. More boutiques wanted to carry my products, customer demand remained incredibly strong, sales surged, and rave reviews poured in. For the first time in my life, people were asking me for advice as a business owner. It felt wonderful, but deeply surreal. Then Catherine called, and everything shifted once more. "Are you sitting down?" she asked.
The question immediately made me tense up. What's going on?
"I have an opportunity for you." I let out a soft laugh. "That sounds dangerous." "It might be." I sat down at my desk. "Tell me." Her voice turned serious. "A national distribution opportunity." The room went completely quiet. National. Not regional, not statewide. National. I couldn't say a single word. For a few seconds I just stared at the wall, convinced I had misheard her. "Catherine." "I know." My voice shook. "Are you serious?" "Dead serious." The opportunity was massive. Life-altering. The kind of break small business owners dream about for decades. The kind most people never get. As Catherine explained the details, excitement and fear fought for control inside me. Because an opportunity like this came with conditions, requirements, deep scrutiny, legal verifications, business audits, and one crucial condition. They needed absolute ironclad proof that Elliott Home Fragrances was entirely legally independent. My stomach tightened instantly because I already knew where the problems lay. Richard, the collateral documents, the questionable signatures, the financial entanglements, all of it. Catherine seemed to read my mind. "Deborah." "Yes?" "We can work through this." I nodded slowly. "But it has to be completely clean." There was that word again. Clean, independent, protected. Suddenly everything depended on proving those exact things. After the call ended, I sat alone in the garage, looking around at everything I had built. The rows of products, the boxes ready for shipping. Years of hard work, years of growth, years of persisting with something no one else respected. Now that dream was on the verge of becoming an extraordinary reality. Yet Richard's choices still threatened to tear it away. The thought filled me with dread. Later that evening, another surprise arrived. Catherine called back, but this time her tone was entirely different, more cautious, more deliberate. "What's wrong?" I asked. She hesitated before speaking carefully. "There's something I didn't tell you earlier." My pulse quickened. "What is it?" "I've known about Richard's situation longer than you think." I froze. "What do you mean?"
Silence. Then, several investors have been watching his company for months. A chill ran down my spine. For months?
"Yes." I gripped the phone tightly. "How bad is it?" Catherine's answer was quiet, almost gentle. "It's worse than what's being reported." The room suddenly felt much colder. Because if Catherine was right, Richard's downfall wasn't just approaching. It had already begun, and very soon the whole world was going to know. The first time Richard referred to Elliott Home Fragrances as our business, I nearly laughed out loud. It wasn't out of amusement, but sheer disbelief. After years of dismissing my work as a hobby, a cute little project, or just pin money for a housewife, he had suddenly changed his vocabulary overnight. The shift was so abrupt it told me exactly how desperate he had become. It happened on a Friday afternoon. I was in the garage checking inventory reports when Richard appeared in the doorway. His presence immediately felt unusual. For months he had shown zero interest in my work. Now he stood there, studying the shelves, the products, the shipping station, and the branding. "You've really expanded this place," he remarked. I looked up cautiously. "Yes, I have." He nodded. "Impressive." The compliment sounded strange and unnatural, like hearing someone speak a foreign language they had never practiced. I waited, knowing there was more to come. There always was. Richard walked deeper into the garage. "You know, Deborah." There it was, the specific tone, the calculated build-up. "I've been thinking." I closed my laptop. Those were always dangerous words. "About what?"
He smiled, a strategic practice smile, not a warm one. "About the future."
My guard went up instantly. For years, discussions about the future only ever meant his future, his goals, and his priorities. Richard leaned against the workbench. "I think we've spent too much time operating completely separately." I stared at him, trying to see where this was going. "What exactly do you mean?" "I mean your business." The phrasing caught my attention. "Your business? Not our business? Not yet, at least." Richard continued. "It's doing remarkably well." I nodded slowly. "Yes, it is. And I think there might be some opportunities here." There was that word. Opportunities. Whenever Richard wanted something, an opportunity magically appeared. What kind of opportunities? His smile widened. An opportunity to collaborate.
For a few seconds, I just stared at him. Then I laughed. A genuine, unfiltered laugh, because the concept was utterly ridiculous. Richard didn't laugh. His expression hardened.
What's so funny? I stood up. You. The word slipped out before I could stop it. His eyes narrowed. What is that supposed to mean? I crossed my arms. It means that for years you told me this business wasn't real. It means you mocked it and you ridiculed it in front of your colleagues. And now suddenly you see an opportunity. Richard looked genuinely uncomfortable, not angry or arrogant, but deeply exposed because every word I said was entirely true. The facts were impossible to deny. After a long pause, he let out a sigh. People change, Deborah. I nearly laughed again. No, Richard. People just reveal who they really are when they run out of options. The conversation ended shortly after, but it didn't resolve the underlying issue. Richard wasn't about to drop it, not by a long shot. Over the next few weeks, his behavior grew increasingly strange. He started asking endless questions about revenues, profit margins, expansion plans, distribution agreements, and future projections. Topics he had completely ignored for years. Now he wanted granular details. It didn't take long to figure out why. His own company was sinking further into a crisis. The newspaper articles kept coming. Industry rumours intensified. More suppliers complained publicly, and major contracts vanished. In the middle of his own collapse, Richard's focus had turned entirely to my growing success. One evening, Catherine called with thrilling news. A national retail buyer wanted a formal meeting. Not an introductory call or a preliminary review, but a real major corporate presentation. The kind of meeting that could scale the business instantly. When she told me, I was so overwhelmed I almost cried. After the call, I sat alone in the garage, smiling. For years I had dreamed of moments like this, and now they were actually happening. Genuine growth and real success. Unfortunately, Richard overheard part of the conversation, and that changed everything. The next morning, he appeared unusually cheerful, which was suspicious on its own. Richard Elliot was not a cheerful man by nature, especially lately. Over breakfast, he poured a cup of coffee and smiled. Big meeting coming up, I hear. I looked up carefully. Potentially. The smile stayed fixed on his face. That's incredibly exciting. The friendliness felt forced, like a salesman reciting a script. When I didn't say anything, Richard continued. You know, I've been thinking. About what? Maybe I should attend. I blinked. Attend what? The buyer meeting? For a second I thought he was joking, but his face told me he was entirely serious. You want to come to my meeting? Richard nodded. Of course. The absolute confidence in his voice stunned me. He acted as if the idea was perfectly logical, as if he belonged there, as if he had helped build any of it. I stared at him incredulous. Why? He answered instantly. Because we're partners. We're married. I let out a short, humorless laugh. That's not an answer. Richard's smile vanished. It's business, Deborah. No, I said, shaking my head. It's my business. The room turned dangerous and quiet. For the first time in my life, I saw a flash of real resentment cross his face. I've spent decades building corporate relationships, he said, adjusting his posture. I can help you handle this. There it was. The justification, the rationalization, the excuse. But I knew the truth. This wasn't about helping me. This was about visibility, control, and finding a way in. Richard's company was going under. Mine was rising, and he couldn't handle the idea of being left behind. A few days later, things escalated. I received a phone call from Ethan Parker. His voice sounded strained and full of concern. Brr. Immediately my stomach knotted. What's wrong? I just received an email. A wave of dread washed over me. What kind of email? A brief pause. It's from Richard. I closed my eyes. Of course he did. What does it say? Ethan hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. He introduced himself as your strategic partner and corporate advisor. For a few seconds, I couldn't say a word. Strategic partner. The phrase echoed in my mind, and my hands began to shake out of pure, unadulterated anger. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a mistake. This was deliberate. Richard was forcing his way into something he had never contributed to. never supported, and actively ridiculed.
I immediately apologised profusely to Ethan. Fortunately, he remained entirely professional. Don't worry about it, Deborah. We know the setup. But I did worry, because boundaries mattered and Richard had just crossed a massive one.
That afternoon, I drove straight to Melissa's office. When I explained what happened, her expression turned entirely serious. "Do you have the documentation proving you are the sole legal owner?" I nodded. "Good." She opened a file folder, a small smile appearing for the first time all day. "Because we are completely prepared for this." Inside were the corporate filings, registration records, ownership certificates, bank statements, everything proving the absolute truth. Elliott Home Fragrances belonged entirely to Deborah Elliott, not Richard Elliott, not the two of us, just me. For the first time in weeks, I felt a wave of profound relief. A few days later, the buyer meeting finally arrived. I was nervous, excited, terrified, but completely determined. When I walked into the conference room, Ethan greeted me warmly. Several corporate executives were seated around the table, and Catherine was there too. The atmosphere felt professional, optimistic, and full of promise. Then the door opened, and Richard walked in. My heart stopped. For one terrifying second, I couldn't breathe. He had actually shown up, without permission, without an invitation, and without warning. Richard smiled confidently, looking around as if he owned the room, as if he owned my success. Before he could even sit down, Ethan stood up calmly and professionally, placing a folder flat on the conference table. It was the exact legal documentation Melissa had prepared. The ironclad proof of ownership, demonstrating that Richard had absolutely zero legal role, stake, or authority in the company. I watched the realization hit Richard's face. It was a slow, painful, incredibly public moment. For the first time in his life, he wasn't the most important person in the room, and everyone there knew it. I had never seen Richard truly embarrassed in public before. Annoyed, yes. Angry, frequently. But humiliated? Never. At least, not until that meeting. The moment Ethan Parker placed those ownership documents on the conference table, the entire power dynamic shattered. Everyone in the room maintained total professionalism. No one mocked him, no one laughed, and no one pointed fingers. In a way, that made it worse because the facts spoke for themselves. The paperwork stated clearly that Elliott Home Fragrances belonged exclusively to me. Every filing, every registration, every bank account, and every legal record. No partnership, no joint ownership, no executive role, and no involvement whatsoever. Richard stared at the documents, then at Ethan, and finally at me. For a moment he looked completely disoriented. The confident executive who used to dominate every room was suddenly left entirely speechless. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "Mr. Elliott, we appreciate your interest." Interest, not partnership, not leadership. Interest, a carefully chosen word, and everyone understood the distinction. Richard gave a stiff nod, attempting to pull his composure back together. Years of corporate experience helped him recover some dignity, but the damage was done. A few moments later, he left the meeting without saying a word, looking at no one as the door closed behind him. The room fell quiet. Then Catherine spoke up. "Shall we proceed?" And we did. For the next 2 hours, we discussed growth strategies, production capacity, distribution logistics, and future opportunities. For the first time in my life, I sat at a major corporate table, not as someone's wife, a guest, or a bystander, but as the business owner, the decision-maker, and the founder. The feeling was almost overwhelming. At the end of the session, Ethan shook my hand. "We are incredibly excited about this partnership, Deborah." I smiled, a real, genuine smile, not the polite mask I had worn for years. I had earned that moment myself. Not Richard, not anyone else. Just me. But while my business forged ahead, Richard's world collapsed faster than ever. 3 weeks later, the formal restructuring filings were processed. I found out the same way everyone else did, through the news. Columbus Packaging Group had filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The headlines spread rapidly through local news, business publications, and industry websites. For the first time, Richard could no longer hide behind vague explanations. The crisis was public, official, and undeniable. That night, he came home looking utterly exhausted, older than I had ever seen him. His shoulders slumped, his face looked drawn, and his characteristic confidence had vanished. Yet even then, he refused to talk about it at first. I stood in the kitchen, watching him silently pour himself a drink. Finally, I asked, "Is it true?" Richard stared into his glass, then simply nodded. The gesture felt surprisingly heavy. "Yes," he said. "Nothing more. Just yes." The silence that followed was massive. For decades, Richard had built his entire identity around corporate success. Now that identity was completely fracturing, and neither of us knew what was left underneath. A week later, things took a turn for the worse. Melissa called me, her voice incredibly grave. "Deborah, I need you to come to the office immediately." My stomach tightened. "What's wrong?" "The bankruptcy proceedings have triggered an additional layer of administrative review," she said. "And I think you need to hear this in person." The next morning, I arrived at her office to find several folders spread across the conference table. Melissa looked calm and focused. I sat opposite her. "What's happening?" She opened one of the files. "Richard's corporate restructuring has initiated a deep financial audit." I nodded slowly as she slid a document toward me. "The financing agreements he submitted are being formally questioned." My pulse quickened. The agreements, the collateral, the signatures, everything. I already saw where this was heading. "What did they find?" Melissa looked at me directly. "Irregularities." The word sounded simple, but its implications were massive. Administrative irregularities meant investigations, which meant evidence, which led straight to legal accountability. She continued, "Multiple parties are now demanding clarity regarding your authorization." I let out a bitter laugh. "My authorization?" The problem was there was no authorization. The documents claimed I was involved, but reality said otherwise. Melissa opened another folder. "The issue of the unauthorized signatures is becoming a central point of the inquiry." Hearing those words out loud still shocked me. Unauthorized signatures. Even now, a part of me struggled to accept that the man I had been married to for 35 years was willing to legally and financially compromise me to save his own skin.
"What happens next?" I asked.
Melissa's expression remained serious. "That depends entirely on how deep the court decides to look." The answer hung in the room, heavy and real. A few weeks later, I attended my first bankruptcy hearing. The experience felt completely surreal. Courts were things meant for television or other people's lives, not mine. Yet there I was, sitting quietly in the back, listening to attorneys debate decisions that would shape my future. The room was packed with creditors, former business partners, lawyers, and financial representatives. All people whose livelihoods had been impacted by Richard's corporate collapse. For the first time, I grasped the true scale of the disaster. This wasn't just a business failing, it was a domino effect. Employees had lost jobs, suppliers had taken massive losses, and families were impacted. The fallout reached far beyond Richard. Then I spotted Linda Foster sitting a few rows ahead, composed and prepared, holding a thick binder. When our eyes met, she gave me a small supportive nod. The hearing lasted for hours, as financial reports were dissected, debts reviewed, assets examined, and liabilities questioned. Then Linda was called to provide her statement. The courtroom grew noticeably quiet. She walked to the front confidently and began to speak. Her testimony was objective, professional, and precise. No emotion, no exaggeration, just the facts. But those facts painted a devastating picture of delayed payments, broken promises, misleading statements, and highly questionable corporate practices. Every word seemed to diminish Richard's standing in the room. His confidence visibly eroded.
Next, it was Melissa's turn. My heart hammered against my ribs because I knew exactly what she held. The evidence of the unauthorized signatures. She stepped forward calmly, presenting the files to the court. Ownership records, business filings, financial separations, timelines, and finally, the discrepancies in the documentation.
A heavy silence filled the room as copies were reviewed. The evidence didn't need theatrical presentation. It spoke perfectly for itself. I watched Judge Harold Benson, a man known for his patience, fairness, and strict attention to detail. Throughout the hearing, he listened intently, asked sharp questions, and took meticulous notes. When Melissa finished, the judge studied the documents for what felt like an eternity. Finally, he looked up, his expression unreadable. "The court finds these discrepancies deeply concerning," Judge Benson announced, his voice echoing in the silent room. "There is clear justification for a formal, independent inquiry into these financial arrangements." A formal inquiry, an investigation, a breakthrough. I looked over at Richard. His face had gone completely pale. For the first time since this nightmare began, he looked genuinely terrified. This was no longer just about a failing company. It was about real legal accountability. Deep down, I think he finally realized it. As the hearing concluded and people began to filter out, Melissa walked over to me. Her expression was calm, but her eyes held absolute confidence. "We did the right thing, Deborah." I nodded slowly. The truth had finally caught up with Richard, and no amount of corporate charm or excuses could stop it now. The night Richard finally told me the truth was bitterly cold. Winter had settled over Columbus, leaving the trees outside our house bare against a grey sky. The wind rattled the windows. For the first time in 35 years, I felt like I was living with a complete stranger. The weeks following the court hearing had been brutal for Richard, for me, and for everyone tied to his company. The court-ordered investigation was moving forward, lawyers were asking sharp questions, and creditors wanted answers. Meanwhile, Elliott Home Fragrances kept thriving. The national distribution deal was progressing steadily. While it wasn't finalized yet, for the first time, I saw a future that went far beyond mere survival, a future built entirely on what I had created. The contrast between our lives was impossible to ignore. One business was expanding, the other was dissolving. One future was opening up, the other was shutting down. And neither of us knew how to talk about it anymore. That evening, I was alone in the garage checking inventory. The familiar scents of lavender and vanilla surrounded me, which usually calmed my mind. But tonight I just felt exhausted and heavy. The sound of the garage door opening pulled me out of my thoughts. I looked up to see Richard standing in the doorway. For a second, I barely recognized him. It wasn't his physical appearance, but something fundamental missing from his posture. The confidence, the arrogance, the absolute certainty, all gone. He looked completely drained emotionally, like a man carrying a weight far heavier than he could manage. Neither of us spoke as he stepped inside. "I need to talk to you," he said. The phrase immediately made my stomach knot because Richard never said things like that, not with genuine vulnerability. I closed my laptop. Okay. For a moment, he just stood there, as if he didn't even know where to begin. That alone was jarring. Richard always knew what to say. He always controlled the narrative. Tonight was different. Finally, he sat down in the chair opposite me. The very chair I had used for months to pack orders, the one he used to mock. The irony wasn't lost on me. "I ruined it," he said flatly. The admission was so unexpected I wasn't sure I heard him correctly. "What?" Richard looked down at his hands. "I ruined everything." The room fell completely silent. In over 3 decades of marriage, I could count the number of times Richard admitted to being wrong on one hand. This felt unprecedented. I waited, wanting him to keep speaking without interruptions, excuses, or damage control. To my surprise, he did. For nearly an hour, Richard admitted to things he had never acknowledged before. How losing major contracts had crippled his cash flow, how he had ignored clear warnings from his senior managers, how he believed his reputation alone would protect him, and how he convinced himself every crisis was just temporary. Every poor choice had forced him into an even worse one. Listening to him felt completely surreal. For years, Richard had positioned himself as the smartest person in the room. Now he was laying out a chain of errors, failures, and sheer hubris. When he finally stopped speaking, the silence returned. Then I asked the question that had haunted me for months. "Why did you do that to me, Richard?"
He raised his eyes to meet mine. For a second I thought he would deflect. Instead, he gave me a shocking answer.
"I was jealous." I blinked, certain I had misheard. "What?" Richard let out a sad, bitter laugh, the kind people make when they finally admit a painful truth. "I was jealous of you The words felt impossible. Richard Elliot, jealous of me? The idea seemed absurd. Yet, he continued, the more successful your business became, the more I hated seeing it thrive. I stared at him, trying to connect this confession to the man I thought I knew. Why? His answer was quiet, stripped of any attempt to impress anyone, including himself. Because you are succeeding on your own. The simplicity of the statement made it devastating. I waited as he went on. My entire identity was built on being the provider, the successful one. That was who I was. He paused before delivering the real truth. When your company started to grow, I looked at these shelves and realized something. He swallowed hard. You didn't need me anymore. The realization hit me with unexpected force. It revealed exactly how he viewed our marriage in terms of need, dependency, and control. Somewhere along the way, he had confused being valued with being needed. When that dependency vanished, he panicked. The thought filled me with a profound sadness.
After a few quiet minutes, I brought up another memory. That dinner party. You mocked me in front of everyone.
Richard nodded slowly, painfully. Yes. Why? Because I needed everyone to keep seeing me as the important one, he admitted instantly. The sheer honesty shocked me. No excuses, no shifting blame, no rationalizations. Just the ugly truth. For the first time all evening, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't forgiveness, but understanding. I finally understood why he did it, even if it didn't erase the deep hurt he caused. Then Richard leaned forward. His expression changed, the vulnerability vanishing to reveal pure desperation. Before he even spoke, I knew exactly where this was going. Deborah, there it was, the real reason for this visit, the honesty and the confession. My heart sank. What is it? Richard hesitated before finally putting it out there. I need help, of course. I closed my eyes briefly, not out of anger, but profound disappointment. For a fleeting moment, I had allowed myself to believe this conversation was about accountability and healing. Instead, we were right back to financial rescue. How much? The question slipped out before I could check it. Richard looked deeply ashamed, but desperate. A significant amount. I let out a soft laugh at the inevitability of it. What exactly are you asking for? The investigation, the creditors, the legal fees. He took a deep breath. If I can just stabilize things. I stared at him, waiting for the final shoe to drop. I need to draw some funds from your business account. The garage went painfully quiet. Every emotion I had felt through his confession suddenly made perfect sense. The vulnerability had all been leading to this single request for a rescue. For the first time, I saw the situation with absolute clarity. Richard wasn't sitting across from me because he finally recognized my worth. He was sitting there because he finally needed my resources. There was a massive difference between the two. Looking at the man I had loved for 35 years, a deep sadness settled over me as the final truth crystallized. Richard wasn't asking for forgiveness or reconciliation. He was asking for capital. And in that exact moment, I knew our marriage was over. I didn't give Richard an answer that night. After 35 years, I owed myself time. Time to think, to breathe, and to separate empathy from obligation. Because those two things are not the same. Long after Richard went upstairs, I sat alone in the garage, surrounded by the products that had changed my life. The candles, the soaps, the gift sets. Items that had once seemed trivial, things my husband had laughed at, now represented something far greater. My independence. For the first time, I allowed myself to ask the question I had avoided for months. What do I actually want? Not what Richard needs, or what our children might think, or what a society expects. What does Deborah Elliot want? The answer came instantly. Peace. I wanted peace. The realization was both simple and heartbreaking, because peace had been missing from my life for a very long time. The next morning, Richard found me in the kitchen drinking coffee. His eyes searched my face immediately, looking for hope, for a lifeline, for a rescue. I kept my voice entirely calm. I've thought about what you said. He sat down opposite me, waiting. I took a deep breath. I'm not giving you the money, Richard. The statement hung heavily in the air, absolute and final. For a moment, he didn't react. Then a wave of profound disappointment washed over his face. It wasn't surprise, but the look of a man who realized his safety net was completely gone.
"You don't understand," he muttered.
The phrase sparked immediate annoyance because I understood perfectly. For years, Richard had confused a disagreement with a lack of understanding. Anyone who challenged him simply didn't get it. Not this time. "No, Richard," I said, looking right at him. "I understand exactly what's happening. You made choices. You ignored the warnings. You emptied our personal savings. You leveraged my company, and you unauthorizedly signed documents." I laid out every fact, leaving him no room to argue or escape accountability. He stared at the table for a few seconds, then gave a slow, painful nod. The admission of defeat was more striking than any shouting match because it arrived far too late. Finally, Richard stood up without a word. No anger, no yelling. He just quietly walked away. For the first time, I saw him entirely defeated. Strangely, it didn't give me any sense of victory, only a deep sadness. Over the next few weeks, the house became quieter than it had ever been. There was no hostility or drama, just an absolute stillness, like two people slowly drifting toward completely opposite shores. The restructuring case continued. The investigation moved forward, the lawyers kept working, and life marched on. So did I. Shortly after, the National Distribution Agreement was officially finalized. I still remember the moment Ethan called with the news. I was standing in the garage where this entire journey began, and when he told me, tears came to my eyes. It wasn't about the money or the status. It was the validation that someone truly believed in what I had built.
The small business Richard had laughed at was now heading into retail stores across the country. The irony wasn't lost on me, nor was the lesson. Success doesn't arrive when others believe in you. It happens when you persist long enough to fully believe in yourself.
A month later, I met with Melissa. Our conversation wasn't about the business, audits, or corporate filings anymore. It was about divorce. Even now, the word feels strange to write. Divorce. After 35 years, I never imagined my life taking this path. Not once, not even during our worst arguments. But the reality had become completely unavoidable. The trust was gone, the respect was gone, and the partnership had dissolved. All that remained was shared history, and history alone isn't enough to sustain a marriage. Melissa listened quietly as I explained my decision, then nodded supportively. "You sound very certain, Deborah." I thought about it, then offered a gentle smile. For the first time in a very long time, I actually am. The legal process began quickly and without dramatic arguments or courtroom battles. It was simply two people acknowledging a reality that could no longer be changed. The marriage had ended long before the paperwork was drafted. The documents just made it official. A few months later, I moved into a smaller home just outside Columbus. It wasn't grand or luxurious, but it was entirely mine. Every room felt peaceful. Every morning felt lighter, and for the first time in decades, I could hear my own thoughts. I could make decisions without facing criticism, celebrate successes without minimization, and dream without needing anyone's permission. The freedom felt unfamiliar at first, then absolutely beautiful. Meanwhile, Elliott Home Fragrances kept expanding. New retail partnerships developed, customer demand rose, and my small team grew into a fully staffed operation. The company that once crowded a single garage now occupied a professional commercial workspace. Sometimes I would walk through the building, stopping to just take it all in. The employees, the inventory, the vibrant energy of a thriving business. Every time I did, I recalled that dinner party, the laughter, the humiliation, the exact moment Richard called it a cute little hobby. I didn't remember it out of a desire for revenge, but as a vital reminder that other people's limiting opinions reflect their own boundaries, not your potential. One afternoon, Sarah came to visit the new office. She walked slowly through the facility, taking everything in, before turning to me with a smile. "You know, Deborah, you've become a real inspiration around town." I laughed. "No, I haven't." "Yes, you have," she insisted. She wasn't joking. Local business groups had started sharing my story. Women's organizations invited me to speak, and aspiring entrepreneurs reached out for advice. The attention felt unusual, but I understood the draw. People weren't inspired by the products themselves. They were moved by the resilience, the second chance, and the proof that you can completely reinvent your life, especially later in life.
One evening, after everyone had left for the day, I sat alone in my office. The building was quiet, and outside the setting sun cast a warm golden glow across the room. I thought back to the woman I used to be, the one who constantly sought Richard's approval, who doubted her own capabilities, and who believed it was too late to start over. She felt so distant now, yet she remained a part of me, the reason I survived, the reason I persisted, and the reason I finally understood a crucial truth. You don't need anyone else's validation to become who you are meant to be.
Looking around the office one last time before heading home, a profound feeling washed over me. It wasn't a sense of triumph over Richard, but something far better: total freedom. For the first time in my life, I wasn't living as Richard Elliott's wife. I was living completely as Deborah Elliott, and that was more than enough. 8 months after moving out of the home Richard and I had shared for over 3 decades, I found myself standing in the center of a major national retail convention in Chicago. If someone had told me a few years ago that I would be attending as the founder of a rapidly growing national brand, I would have dismissed it entirely. Not because it was impossible, but because I hadn't yet believed I deserved to be there. The convention center was massive, with thousands of retail buyers, corporate executives, and entrepreneurs moving through the hall. For most of my life, events like this belong to other people: the confident, the established, the successful. Now, I was one of them. The realization still felt deeply rewarding. Near the center of the exhibition hall stood our prominent display for Elliott Home Fragrances, featuring professional signage, beautiful product showcases, and sleek branding. Every time I looked at the company name, I thought of that original garage setup: the makeshift shelves, the late nights, the self-doubt, the tears, and yes, the mockery. I didn't remember the slights out of lingering hurt, but as a marker of exactly how far the journey had taken me. Throughout the event, dozens of people stopped by our booth: existing retail partners, prospective corporate buyers, and visitors asking for photos or advice. The experience felt wonderfully surreal. At one point, Catherine stepped up beside me, quietly admiring the display before turning to me with a smile. "Look at what you've done here, Deborah." I smiled back. "Look at what we've done." She shook her head, her voice softening. "No, I just opened a door for you. You're the one who had the courage to walk through it." For a moment, emotion caught in my throat because she was absolutely right. Catherine had offered guidance, mentorship, and belief, but she couldn't do the heavy lifting for me. No one could. The work had always been mine, just as the success belonged to me now, and just as my past choices were mine to own. Responsibility works both ways, a concept Richard could never quite grasp. Late that afternoon, the unexpected happened. I was finishing a conversation with a buyer when I noticed someone standing at the edge of the booth, quietly watching and waiting. My heart skipped a beat. It was Richard. He looked noticeably older. The toll of the past year was clearly visible. His hair was completely grey, his face drawn, and his posture lacked the absolute certainty he once carried. The change wasn't exaggerated, but it was undeniable. Life had altered him. When the buyer finally stepped away, it left the two of us alone. For a few seconds, neither of us said a word. Then Richard offered a small, tentative smile. Not the grin of a man expecting to dominate a room, but someone hoping for a moment of kindness. "Hello, Deborah," he said quietly. I offered a polite smile. "Hello, Richard." The exchange felt strange. Two people who had shared an entire lifetime now speaking like distant acquaintances. He looked around the booth, taking in the products, the branding, the customers, and the clear evidence of success. Everything he had once dismissed. "This is incredibly impressive," he remarked. I let out a soft laugh. "You've said that before." A faint smile touched his face, and I deserved that response. His candor caught me by surprise. We stood in silence for a moment before he let out a quiet sigh. "I wasn't entirely sure you'd want to see me." I considered his words honestly before replying. "I wasn't entirely sure either." That brought out a genuine laugh from him, the first real laugh I had heard from him in a very long time. The old resentment was gone. The corporate arrogance had vanished, and what remained was just a man facing his reality. We talked for a few minutes, not about legal proceedings, restructuring, or past blame, but just about everyday life. Simple, ordinary things. The conversation felt unexpectedly peaceful. Then Richard looked back at the company logo, Elliott Home Fragrances. He gazed at it for a long moment before speaking softly. "You really built something remarkable." There was no jealousy in his voice, no lingering bitterness, just total acknowledgement. And strangely, that meant something to me. Not because I needed his validation anymore, that chapter of my life was firmly closed, but because it was the first time he had fully recognized the reality of my achievement without attempting to minimize it or elevate himself. I nodded. "Yes, I did." Richard swallowed hard, looking me directly in the eye, offering the words he should have said years ago. "I'm sorry, Deborah." The apology was simple, but it carried far more weight than any elaborate explanation or excuse ever could. For a few seconds I didn't say anything, not out of anger, but because a wave of memories came rushing back. The dinner party, the public mockery, the moments of feeling minimized, the years of self-doubt, and the time wasted chasing an approval that was never going to come. Finally, a genuine smile came over my face. As it did, an unexpected realization settled in. I wasn't angry anymore. Not even a little bit. The lingering resentment had completely dissolved. Not because Richard necessarily earned forgiveness, but because I completely deserved my own peace. People often view letting go as a gift to someone else, but most of the time, it's a gift you give entirely to yourself. "Thank you, Richard," I said softly. He nodded, his eyes reflecting a brief flash of emotion before he looked away. We stood there quietly for another moment, connected by decades of shared history that had ended in a way neither of us could have ever predicted. "You know what the funniest part is?" he asked quietly, looking back up.
I smiled slightly. "What's that?"
He glanced at the bustling booth, then back at me. The thing I was most terrified of losing wasn't the company. The statement surprised me. Then what was it? "Losing my sense of who I was," he answered instantly. I looked at him, and for the first time, I believed him completely. Richard's corporate troubles had never been the true core of his crisis. His pride was. The business collapse had simply exposed that pride, just as my business growth had revealed my own capabilities. We all find things to hide behind. Titles, status, financial standing, relationships. The real danger is mistaking those external markers for our actual worth. Richard had spent decades doing exactly that, until life publicly stripped them away, forcing him to discover who was actually left underneath. Finally, he extended his hand. I looked at it, then reached out and shook it. It was a quiet conclusion to our story, but it felt entirely right. No dramatic reunions, no turning back the clock, just a mutual respect. The exact element that had been missing for so long. A few minutes later, Richard turned and disappeared into the crowded convention center. I watched him go, then turned back toward my display, facing my own future and the independent life I had built. For a long time, I just stood there, observing the energy around me. The team, the buyers, the endless opportunities ahead. Suddenly, my mind flashed back to that dinner party years ago. The exact moment Richard laughed, and everyone joined in. For years I believed that moment defined my humiliation and failure. Now I saw it through an entirely different lens. That precise moment was actually the catalyst. It was the beginning of the life I was truly meant to build, and the beginning of the woman I was always meant to become. The woman standing here today, confident, independent, completely at peace. And finally, truly free. The reality was that Richard Elliott had laughed at my small business, only to watch his own empire dissolve. But that wasn't the real heart of the story. The true story was about a woman who spent decades doubting herself, who finally discovered her own undeniable worth, and once she found it, no one could ever take it away from her again.